Odalys Fenwick paid the Meriwether County Tax Office $11,000 for 58 full acres that nobody at the auction wanted to look at twice. A bid so quiet, the clerk had to ask her to repeat her own name for the record. The parcel had gone unpaid for 6 years. The previous owner long since moved off and untraceable, and by the time the county put it up for sale, the land had disappeared entirely under kudzu, wild grape, and blackberry bramble, grown so thick in places that a person could not walk a straight line through it without a machete and a good deal of patience. The auctioneer read the acreage off a card and moved on quickly, the way a man moves on from a lot he does not expect to hold anyone's attention for more than a few seconds. Nobody bid against her, and the whole transaction was finished in less time than it took her to find parking outside the courthouse that morning. She was not originally from Meriwether County, and she had never farmed a single day in her life before that spring, a fact everyone in Warm Springs seemed to know within a week of the sale closing. Passed along the way, news travels in a small town, through the bank teller and the hairdresser, and eventually the man at the feed store. Odalys had spent 30 long years in property management down in Atlanta before she retired early, tired in a way she could not fully explain to people who asked. And she had bought that overgrown acreage the way some people buy a boat, on a hunch and a number that felt low enough to risk without losing sleep over it. What she did with it in the first month made even less sense to her new neighbors than the purchase itself. She did not rent a bulldozer. She did not hire a crew with brush cutters, the way most people in that county would have if they had come into that kind of overgrown acreage and had any real money to throw at it. She bought 40 feral hogs from a trapper 2 counties over, animals considered a nuisance and a menace by nearly everyone else in that part of Georgia, hunted and trapped and complained about at every county meeting for the damage they did to row crops, and she turned them loose on 58 acres of vine choked ground behind a fence she had strung herself over 3 exhausting weekends. People in town found that funnier than the purchase. Turning hogs loose on land that thick, they said, was not clearing it. It was just feeding it to something that would tear it up worse than the kudzu already had, handing one problem to a second one and calling it a solution. 8 months later, in a low corner of that same property where the vines had been thickest of all, those same hogs rooted down through decades of buried leaf litter and collapsed soil and uncovered the stone foundation, the iron mechanism, and the standing lower wall of a grist mill that had not turned a single stone since some time before the First World War, a piece of the county's own history that had simply vanished from living memory, along with the vegetation that buried it. If stories about overlooked land, forgotten history, and the wisdom hiding under what everybody else had already written off means something to you, subscribe and join our farming family. And tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight, wherever that happens to be. We would love to know how far this story has traveled. Meriwether County sits in the rolling Piedmont of west central Georgia, red clay hills cut through by small, steady creeks that once turned the wheels of dozens of small water-powered mills before roads and rail made central milling cheaper and local mills, one after another, quietly went dark over the first decades of the 20th century, their machinery rusting in place and their buildings slowly falling to whatever claimed them first, fire or flood or simple neglect. Kudzu arrived in the region decades later, brought in originally as erosion control and forage before it escaped into exactly the kind of abandoned, unmanaged ground that a defaulted tax parcel becomes once nobody is left to mow or graze it. Left alone, kudzu and the tangle of native bramble that grows up alongside it can bury a fence line, a barn, even a small building within a decade or two, burying the ground itself under a mat of vegetation thick enough to block most sunlight from ever reaching the soil again. A green blanket that from a passing car looks almost like a hillside until you notice the unnatural shapes underneath it. Odalys had not read anything about hogs before the auction. She read it after, in a county extension pamphlet from decades earlier that a librarian in Greenville dug out of an archive box for her, almost as an afterthought. A slim, water-stained document describing hog clearing as a once common practice on exactly this kind of reclaimed farmland, fallen almost entirely out of use once herbicide and heavy machinery became the standard answer to the same problem. Faster and cleaner in appearance, if not always in actual result. Here is why it actually works. And it is the whole reason a pen full of nuisance hogs succeeded, where a bulldozer would only have made a mess and moved on. Mowing, or grazing kudzu, removes the vine at the surface, but the plant survives underground in a network of thick, starchy, tuberous roots, some of them growing many feet down and storing enough energy to send the vine climbing right back over cleared ground within a single growing season. A single root crown capable of sending up dozens of new runners once the pressure on it lifts even briefly. Cutting the top growth without touching those roots is, functionally, pruning rather than removal, and it is the reason so many landowners who mow or spray kudzu for years never actually get rid of it, fighting the same vine back to the fence line every single spring without ever once addressing what lives underneath it. A hog does not graze the way a cow or a goat grazes. It roots, using its snout and a keen sense of smell to dig several inches or more into the ground, hunting exactly the kind of starchy tubers and roots that kudzu stores its energy in. And to a hog, kudzu root crowns are simply food worth digging for. A free and apparently endless supply of exactly the calories a foraging animal is built to seek out. Turn a sizable group of hogs loose on vine-choked ground, and they systematically work the soil surface over weeks and months, eating out the root systems that mowing could never touch, turning the ground over in the process the way a plow would, and leaving behind bare, disturbed earth, instead of a still-living root network waiting to resprout the moment the pressure lifts. It is slower than a bulldozer. It is also done patiently, close to permanent, in a way that mechanical clearing on its own rarely manages, since a machine can flatten what is above the ground in an afternoon without ever touching what survives beneath it. And it comes with a side effect nobody in Meriwether County had thought to mention to Odalise before she bought her first 40 hogs, which is that a hog rooting several inches down through soil that has not been disturbed in 100 years will eventually find whatever happens to be buried there. Garner Sykes, who ran cattle on the neighboring section, and who had cleared his own overgrown fence lines with a rented excavator 2 summers earlier, told her plainly, more than once, that hogs on ground that thick were going to do more harm than the kudzu itself, tearing up whatever decent soil remained underneath into a churned, muddy mess that would take years to settle and reseed properly. The kind of damage he had seen firsthand on a cousin's place further south, where an undersized pen of hogs had turned a pasture into something closer to a swamp. He was not being unkind. He had watched hog damage on badly managed pasture before, and he believed, honestly and with real experience behind the opinion, that she was about to ruin 58 acres worse than she had found them, and he said so to her directly, standing at her own fence line, with his hat in his hands, like a man delivering bad news he wished he did not have to. Odalise listened to him carefully, thanked him for the concern the way she had been raised to thank people for concern she had no intention of following, and did it anyway, moving the hogs in sections with portable electric fencing so no single stretch of ground carried the pressure too long, rotating them the way the old extension pamphlet had described rather than simply releasing all 40 onto the whole property at once and hoping for the best. Her son called twice a week that whole first summer, worried in the particular way a grown child worries about a parent who has just spent her retirement savings on feral hogs and an impassable jungle of vines an hour outside a city she no longer lived near. A worry he did not bother disguising as anything gentler than what it actually was. He drove down once in July, walked the fence line with her in the heavy heat, and asked her directly whether she had thought through what would happen if she got hurt out there alone with 40 half-wild animals and no neighbor close enough to hear her call for help, his voice carrying the particular edge of someone who had already run through the worst version of the scenario more than once on the drive down. She told him she had thought about it, more than he probably gave her credit for. She kept a radio on her at all times after that conversation, mostly to put his mind at ease rather than her own, though she never told him that part. There was no real technical failure in any of it. The Hogs did exactly what the old pamphlet said they would do, section by section, month by month. The vine cover thinning, and the bare, rooted earth beneath it slowly becoming visible for the first time in longer than anyone in the county could remember. A transformation that arrived not in a single dramatic afternoon, but in 100 small, muddy, unremarkable ones, stacked one after another. The mill came up in the 9th month, in the lowest corner of the property nearest the creek, exactly the kind of spot a 19th century mill builder would have chosen for the water and the fall it needed to turn a wheel. A stretch of ground the Hogs had reached late in their rotation, simply because it happened to sit at the far end of the property from the pen. Odalys found the first stones herself, walking the newly cleared ground on a Sunday morning with a cup of coffee still in her hand. Dressed stone too regular and too deliberately cut to be anything natural, edges squared in a way no creek ever produces on its own. She stood there a long moment before she even set the coffee down, running her hand along one flat face of stone, still half buried in the churned red dirt the Hogs had left behind. Within another 2 weeks of the Hogs working that same corner, the outline of a foundation, a section of iron gearing rusted nearly solid, and the lower half of what had clearly once been a standing wall had all come up out of ground, that had swallowed the whole structure so completely that not even the oldest people in Warm Springs remembered a mill ever standing on that particular creek. A silence in the local memory that struck Odalys as almost as remarkable as the stone itself. She called the State Historic Preservation Office before she called anyone else, not even her own son, wanting to have something more definite and solid to tell him than a pile of interesting rocks. A state archaeologist named Byron Teague drove out within the month, walked the site for the better part of a day with a clipboard and a small trowel, brushing dirt away from sections of the foundation with the patient, unhurried care of a man who had done this exact kind of work more times than he could easily count, and told her, standing at the edge of the exposed foundation with a notebook full of measurements, that based on the construction and the hardware she was very likely looking at a mill built sometime in the 1850s or 60s, one of dozens that had once dotted small creeks across that part of Georgia, and one of the very few, in his professional experience, ever found this intact after being fully reclaimed by vegetation for the better part of a century. Most similar sites having been bulldozed or built over long before anyone thought to document them properly. Garner Sykes came by to see it not long after word got around the way word gets around in a county that size, and he stood at the edge of the site for a long while without saying much. Hat off this time. The same man who had told her plainly that her hogs were going to ruin the ground looking down at a foundation those same hogs had uncovered instead of destroying. Turning the stone gently over in his mind, the way he turned most things over before he spoke. What followed was not quick, and it was not simple. Documenting and stabilizing a 19th century structure took real money and real permitting, more than Odalys had any intention of carrying alone on a retirement budget already stretched by the hogs and the fencing and the land itself and the county. Once Byron Teague's report became public, took a genuine interest in the site as a piece of local history worth preserving, rather than a curiosity to be forgotten a second time the way it had been forgotten the first. A small historical commission formed to raise funds for a proper survey and stabilization, meeting in the same courthouse where the tax sale had gone through 11 months earlier, and the county itself put forward matching money the following budget cycle. treating what had been an unpaid tax parcel 11 years earlier as, suddenly, one of the more interesting things Meriwether County had to show for itself. A reversal nobody involved in the original auction could have predicted. Nobody has ever found a clear record of who built that mill, or exactly when it stopped turning, or why the family that ran it seems to have left no trace beyond the stone and iron the Hogs finally uncovered a century and a half later. Byron Teague still hopes an old deed or a probate record might surface somewhere in a courthouse archive that has not yet been fully searched. County records from that era being incomplete in the way records from that era so often are, scattered across half a dozen buildings and 2 full centuries of reorganization. Odalise keeps the question open on purpose, in the way she now keeps most of that whole land open, no longer buried, no longer forgotten, and not yet fully explained, a mystery she has come to enjoy more than she ever expected to when she first read the auction listing. Have you ever found something valuable by doing the one thing everybody around you swore would ruin it completely? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and if this story meant something to you, subscribe and let us know where you are watching from tonight.